So the fundamental building block, the atom of green energy transactions is something called a renewable energy credit. The reason why we have renewable energy credits, which are virtual products, renewable energy credits are purely made up. You know, everyone asks me, well, how do you generate a renewable energy credit? And it's very simple. You have to document your energy production, and by documenting your production, you can claim that you've produced renewable energy credits. Now, to sell these credits on a state exchange, you have to abide by the rules of the state exchange, which we'll get into in a moment. But basically, the fundamental point is, you know, when a wind farm dumps power into the electric grid, or when a power plant dumps power into the electric grid, or a solar array dumps electricity in the electric grid, well, you still have no matter where the electricity comes from, you know, you still have your load. And so when you're, let's see, I'm fuddling with my GoToWebinar drawings. When you draw out of the grid, you know, your whatever electrons are nearest that load are going to go and supply your load. It doesn't matter if you're buying your wind energy 800 miles away. If there's a coal power plant between you and the wind farm, chances are physically you're going to get the electrons generated from the coal power plant rather than from the wind power plant, even though you're signed up for the green power plan. You know, what happens is those actual electrons might just go to their nearest load as well, but you get to claim legal rights to that green energy claim. And that's the renewable energy credit is a virtual device to say, rather than try and, you know, build a brand new power line between the windmill and the point of use so that we could physically deliver wind power to your house by constructing this billion-dollar, you know, customized transition line. You know, instead, we're just going to sell electricity like we normally do. You know, electricity in, electricity out, and there's a reconciliation process that we're going to get into. But then the renewable energy credit transaction occurs separately, so that wind farm may separately sell its REC to the user, and that way they can treat all of their energy sales into the grid just like everyone else's energy. It's energy, you sell it for whatever you can get for it, and then you have a separate transaction that values the renewableness of the you know, of the production. Now, that in years past, you know, you might be more familiar with a carbon credit, which a carbon credit kind of gets laughed out of a courtroom because it's very hard to monitor and meter. You know, what is 1 ton of CO2 offset? You know, how many trees do you have to plant? What type of trees do you have to plant? What if those trees get cut down? Do they come and take your carbon credit away? Like, what? You know, carbon credits are very difficult to legislate. Renewable energy credits have more traction in the United States because they're metered. You know, you can claim a renewable energy credit through the production of your solar array. Your solar inverter has a meter inside it, or the solar array is on its own electric meter, similar to all the other meters that the utility provides. So it's metered and tracked to the same degree of accuracy as all other electric sales on the market. We don't have this kind of ambiguous 1 ton of CO2 offset anymore. We have, you know, what would be called renewable mandates or renewable portfolio standards, where, you know, the power plant has to be 5% green per state law, and the wind turbine is 100% green, and it only needs to be 5%. So the wind turbine might sell 95% of its RECs to the power plant, and the power plant, you know, what that would mean is now the wind turbine is no longer renewable, it's only 5% renewable, and the power plant is no longer 100% carbon-based. They're buying 95% of their power, or they're much larger, so they're buying a portion of their power from renewable sources, and they use that to meet the state mandate goals. So the coal power plant stays in operation. The windmill gets an incentive, and if that sounds a lot like cap and trade, it's because it is. It's just the currency is renewable energy credits rather than carbon credits, and it's managed at the state level rather than at the federal level. And I think we can reasonably say that that's not going to change within the next 4 years at the bare minimum. So that's the framework where we're at today. So we have an electric grid that is a series of our homes. We don't consider our homes low voltage. If you go to your state licensing board and you apply for a low voltage contracting license, it means you're like a internet provider dealing with 2-volt circuits, electricity that's not really strong enough to kill you. Whereas if you're a licensed electrician, you're able to deal with high voltage, 240 volts, 208 volts three-phase, maybe 480 volts three-phase, the electric distribution that we use in our homes and buildings. But then you get into the power lines. And in other classes, we compare power, an electron from a power plant, as a boulder sitting on top of the mountain. And voltage is the height of the mountain. And so in order to get this electron to go all the way from this nuclear power plant, for it to roll all the way through the transmission line and distribution line and utility transformers and end up right at your house, you need high voltage to push so that boulder can roll all the way down the mountain. And so as soon as you get out of the power plant, you step up your electricity onto these high voltage power lines called your transmission grid. And then the distribution grid is basically stepping down the high voltage transmission lines, which can be not 2 volts or 240 volts, but hundreds of thousands of volts on high voltage. Then you get to distribution. And your distribution lines are generally lower voltage, maybe around 50 kilovolts or so. And that actually sets how large of a solar farm you can interconnect. Interconnecting to a distribution circuit, there's a couple of things at play here. The first is, well, what's the physical capacity of that line? If it's a 50 kilovolt distribution circuit, typically, you look at, well, how large of an electric service can I get from the power company? If I'm an industrial customer, I might get a 4 megawatt power service, and I could also in turn supply about a 4 megawatt solar power plant on one commercial transformer that's connected to your distribution lines. Now, on top of that, where the utilities perhaps need to do a little bit better job articulating what happens when solar comes to the grid, is at these little distribution nodes where you might hang a transformer right where your electric service is to step down from 50 kilovolts to 240 volts. But then every so often you have these other kind of distribution transformers that eventually make it to the substation that steps you up to higher voltage. And the problem with solar is this. If I have a solar farm and I'm feeding into the distribution transformer, my solar electricity is going one way, all downstream. And so my power from my power plant's going downstream, all of my electricity is coming to the load. Well, all of a sudden, now we have distributed solar, and distributed solar, maybe this home down here, all it's trying to do is push power out to its neighbors, but you're still going through these little distribution circuit nodes that may not be capable of bidirectional electric flow. And so what that means is normally, you know, when solar is 0.1% of the grid, it's not a problem because your electricity just goes from your house into your next door neighbors, and it never makes it to these distribution circuit transformers. But what happens when all of your neighbors on your block get solar is all of a sudden you're backfeeding this distribution transformer. And if that distribution transformer is not capable of bidirectional metering, when it's being backfed, what it registers is that there's a grid fault. You know, what it might be is that a tree has fallen over some distribution power lines. And so automatically, you know, the electric grid needs to shut off because we don't want high voltage power arcing into our, you know, first responders and making, you know, power lines deadly and unfixable. And so these distribution transformers turn off as soon as they're being backfed. And the question is, well, who pays for that upgrade for, you know, upgrading that distribution transformer to bidirectional metering? You know, the solar industry wants, or the utility wants the solar customers to pay for it. The solar customers might say, well, hey, look, you know, the utility needs to adopt to a modern grid which has distributed energy resources. And, you know, while these distribution transformers may need to be upgraded, you know, what non-wires analysis optimization can we do to offset those costs? For instance, you know, you might have a distribution circuit that's at, you know, 90 or 80% capacity. And so the utility says, well, we have to build another distribution circuit to feed this community. And so the solar industry would say, well, why don't instead you upgrade the transformer for bidirectional metering, and so all these guys can start generating their own power and storing their own power and doing load optimization and stuff, so that, you know, they're really, you know, we're taking less load off of the existing infrastructure rather than you know, adding new infrastructure. And there's really not been a good study as to what the cost advantages and cost detriments are for distributed solar. Typically what happens in a rate discussion is the utility says it increases costs, and the renewable guys say, well, the utility hasn't done a good enough job demonstrating how it increases costs, and politics takes over the discussion from that point. So it would be nice to see a little bit more objective analysis into non-wires discussion. But the reality is there's already markets in the United States where you have these overloaded distribution circuits for backfeeding. It may be in a local community like Massachusetts, where they have a super subsidized solar industry, so it's a really good deal to the participant, and so everyone in the community wants solar, and all of a sudden 5 houses on your block have solar, and you can't, even though you have a good rooftop, because that distribution circuit transformer needs an upgrade. Alternately, you have a case like Hawaii, where Hawaii has so much renewable power that now to interconnect a solar array to the grid, you have to program the inverter not to export any power onto the grid. And you might think, well, that's funny because I'm interconnecting to the grid so I can sell the electricity back. The utility says, no, you're not allowed to do that anymore. The consumer could get upset and say, well, PURPA says you have to, and utility says, look, we can't even buy the electricity if we want to, because what you're interconnecting to the grid is making it unstable. So we can't allow you to export power, not because of us wanting to buy electricity or not, but because the infrastructure can't handle it. And what's interesting about those grid connected is arrays that don't export is it's still cheaper than going off grid. You know, paying $30 to $50 a month in an electric bill to have grid access to complement your array power, to keep those battery banks topped up on cloudy days, you know, has advantages to customers. And it's really up to building designers through smarter load leveling to keep that power on site. So just some low-hanging fruit ideas that we've thought about in we're designing an off-grid home is to put the deep freeze on a timer so that the deep freeze only runs during the day. You know, it has enough mass inside that deep freeze to keep the food frozen overnight if you're not opening it up. And so you freeze during the day and you let it coast at night. Alternately, there's all these new smart thermostats and radio-activated power outlets. None of it's really come together in a good, cost-effective commercial product yet, but there are ways to start looking at load leveling and building leveling, even some architecturally pleasing ways that, you know, you might have a water fountain on your property that only turns on when you would otherwise be exporting power onto the grid. Or you might put a immersion water heater inside your electric tank so that your water heater does most of its heavy lifting when you would otherwise be exporting onto the grid. All of that stuff is more the purview of battery-based solar design. But, you know, these are real issues, logistical issues on interconnecting solar, distributed solar to the grid is, you know, can you, or are you going to overload your distribution circuit? You know, it may be easier to do one 4-megawatt project than to do individual, you know, than to do 100 or 1,000 4-kilowatt projects. So let's talk about how electric transactions occur over an electric grid. Now, before deregulation, you have one utility handling all tasks associated with your electric bill. And so on a truly 100% regulated grid, the power company may have received permission from the state utility commission to run all of this infrastructure. And so the same company that you pay your bill to maintains the power lines, maintains the transmission lines, owns the power plant, sells you your electricity, is responsible for the costs. And there's some consumer fear in regulated utilities because they have so much power. You know, they may say, well, solar is not in the interest of our business model or our customers, and so we're not going to have any solar-friendly policies. So, you know, if you're on a regulated grid, such as Mississippi Power in Mississippi, you know, Mississippi is a decade behind the U.S. solar industry, not because of subsidies or anything else, but because the state has a regulated grid and they have zero net metering. Well, they passed what they called net metering, but it was, you know, the opposite of what people in the United States would consider to be net metering. And there's not much you can do about that other than to deregulate the electric grid. Now, that said, regulated utilities have more power, and so it might be easier to implement a project on a regulated grid if you have the utility on board, if you have the utility sign up. And so being able to give them a business model where they make money off of community solar on a regulated grid, that might be a replicable, scalable business model for doing solar in that area. You know, if one project makes money, let's do the next project. Let's do as many as we can until we stop making money. And it's streamlined and implementable. And it's what happens when you deregulate is you divide up roles and responsibilities. And so here we have on a deregulated grid, the people who sell you your electricity are often not allowed to generate their own electricity. And then you might have a separate entity running the transmission side of the grid, and then even another entity running the distribution side of the grid. And so what was one entity is now four. And then there's multiple players, you know, maybe on the maybe you have individual power plant owners. So now you have multiple power generators. You still may only have one entity running the transmission grid, and you still may only have one entity running the distribution grid, but they may be separate entities. And then you might have, you know, a billion different players running the retail side of the electricity sales. And so the theory of grid deregulation is that it inserts competition into the mix. And you now have competition on the supply of electricity, and you have real-time free market competition on the selling of the electricity. On the other hand, it creates a lot of red tape. You know, this is what a deregulated grid cycle looks like. You know, there's a check and balance with the Public Utility Commission. You know, this is what Texas's deregulated electric grid looks like, where you have power generators different from transmission, different from distribution, different from the retail electric providers, and you can see that it's a lot more complicated. And so the real riddle of grid deregulation is, you know, is the consumer more protected or less protected on a deregulated grid? On a deregulated grid, it's harder to pass comprehensive regulations because you have all these players now who are, you know, fighting those regulations left and right. You know, net metering, for example. You know, if you have a regulated grid, the public utility might say, you have to do net metering, otherwise we'll deregulate you. You know, that's a pretty big carrot and stick. You know, on a deregulated grid, if the state tries to pass net metering, the retail electric providers say, well, wait a minute, you know, you're preventing us from generating our own electricity, and now you're saying we have to buy electricity from our customers. You know, that's not really what what the original intent of being a retail electric provider was supposed to be. You know, so you get more objection. Or you might get the distribution companies saying, like, well, what about distribution fees? You know, these customers are paying less distribution fees, and so, you know, our revenue pool is shrinking. The point is, on a deregulated grid, you get a lot more players specifically objecting to how policies impact their slice of the pie, meaning that it might be harder to implement comprehensive measures than on a regulated grid. Of course, on the other hand, the consumer may not be protected on a regulated grid because it may be that the utility and the Public Utility Commission are closer together than the Public Utility Commission and the general public. You know, the general public often doesn't understand how their electric bill works. So what good are they going to be, you know, providing input to the Public Utility Commission? And, you know, that can lead to abuse associated with monopolies. But it could also lead to very solar-friendly policies as well, or consumer-friendly policies as well. The point is, it's just different. You know, on a regulated grid, you're going to have to work with the utility to do community solar projects, you know, through whatever renewable standard offers or whatever programs they have. They're the king maker in the model. Whereas on a deregulated grid, there's a lot more red tape that you have to jump through to become a power generator, selling your electricity to a retail electric provider and signing up customers, etc. There's a lot more you have to do. But then again, there's no one entity that can stand in your way and say, well, we just don't want to do it, so we're not going to do it. So different flavors of barbecue for sure. What I think is really interesting is on deregulated markets, how electric sales work. You know, you can have long-term contracts written in place, but you might only write those contracts for 80% of your power supply because, you know, just like everybody's electric use varies from job site A to job site B, you know, the weather changes from day to day, and you can only accurately predict the weather, you know, a few days in advance, aside from long-term trends. And so, you know, when you get down to it, if you've only contracted for 80 gigawatt hours of electricity, and then all of a sudden you see that a heat wave is coming through tomorrow, and your customers actually need 90 gigawatt hours of electricity, and you've only contracted for 80, what do? Or if you've contracted for 80 and you see that it's going to be mild weather and you only need 70, what do? Well, in Texas's model, they have a day ahead auction market where you can, you know, take whatever extra capacity you need and bid 1 day in advance for that capacity. And then if you fall short, if your customers still require more electricity than what you bought and paid for, there's a settlement process that says, well, which generator supplied that power, you know, based on what they've dumped in and what they're contracted to dump in, and how has that settlement, you know, occurred. So there's a day-ahead auction system, and then kind of a real-time value of electricity that feeds a day after settlement process. And, you know, the only way to facilitate this kind of energy transaction is basically to treat electrons like virtual objects, like stocks and bonds, to say, all right, I bought, you know, X many shares of power, and I needed Y many shares of power, and so, you know, we need to settle up to make sure all of our accounts are in order. And for that reason, utilities are very comfortable with kind of paper transactions of electrons, even though they're not physically controlling which electrons came from where. You know, it's more of an accounting exercise to make sure that all the accounts are properly settled up. And all of that was just to say that, you know, renewable energy credits, you know, if you're coming from it from a perspective of, I hate carbon credits, these things are imaginary, I don't like them, well, the utility has a little bit more of a warmer approach for renewable energy credits because, you know, while these credits are virtual, you know, while they are literally made up by simply documenting your generation and claiming that you have them, you know, when you get down to it, a lot of utility transactions are already dealing with kind of the virtual side of account balancing rather than the physical side of transferring that electron from point A to point B. So utilities are already kind of tuned into virtual exchanges of electricity, and so virtually exchanging renewable energy credits is not that big of a deal. Taking a step sideways, it's always good to go onto your utility website and check out what their solar policies are. This is Reliant. Reliant is a retail electric provider on Texas's grid. So Reliant is this guy right here under retail electric provider. So Reliant, they used to be the retail electric provider and the power generation company and transmission distribution, and then they got deregulated, and now they do that. So this is in Texas, and Texas has no state-required net metering. But look at this. This is kind of interesting. What they do have with Reliant is a plan where you get free nights and weekends. Well, this one is just free weekends. So no energy charge during the week, and then your no energy charge during the weekend. So from 8 of Friday to Monday, you're not using energy. During the week, you are. Well, if that fits your work schedule, if you don't have kids at home, if, you or you and your wife or you and your husband work during the day and are home on weekends, this can actually improve your solar economics even without net metering, because your solar array is eliminating that elevated energy charge during the weekday when you're not at the house. And then when you're at home on the weekends using tons of electricity, that electricity is at a lower rate, even at night too. So this way your solar array, saves you money during the day, but those savings extend into the night. And maybe that offsets the fact that you're not getting a true retail value credit for the electricity that you export if you can get cost savings at other times of the day. Also on Reliant, they have another plan that's very interesting to me, because this is a net metering plan that Reliant is offering. So in a deregulated market where there is no state net metering law, you still have a retail electric provider offering net metering. And I think philosophically that's pretty profound, because what's it saying? Is it saying that net metering is not profitable for the retail electric provider? I mean, they should be able to make that argument, because that means they're doing less sales if their customer is buying less electricity. But what Reliant is gaining by offering net metering is, one, they're gaining all of the solar customers in that grid, because that's the only net metering game in town. Well, it's them and Green Mountain. A couple other guys offer net metering in, say, Houston, Texas, even though they're not mandated to. But also, not all solar customers offset 100% of their electric bill. Many solar customers only offset 30% or 60%. And so the retail electric provider is picking up some energy sales. And on top of that, the retail electric provider is picking up those account fees, those metering fees. And so even if the solar customer doesn't buy a dime of electricity, the retail electric provider still gets that $20 a month, $30 a month grid access fee, which I think is very important, because what this means is that in a truly deregulated market where you have free market competition, you have retail electric providers voluntarily offering net metering. And that would not happen if net metering cost them money. And so then you get into a regulated grid discussion where the utility goes in front of a public utility board and says, well, we're not going to do net metering because net metering costs us money and it costs our customers money. Well, how is that the case if retail electric providers are competing for solar customers in deregulated grids? So what that means is the utility, if they want to make arguments that solar is actually raising costs on non-participants, they need to be a little bit more detailed than just making philosophic overtures about who's subsidizing whom. We need to get down to the brass tacks on if solar is actually raising electricity prices or not before we make those claims. A lot of studies now are showing that solar is reducing and actually crashing the price of daytime electricity and making nighttime electricity, more expensive. Then again, historically, nighttime electricity has been cheap and daytime electricity has been what's expensive. So how much of this is actually raising costs on consumers versus, keeping electricity prices low compared to other forms of grid expansion? I know in Mississippi, where I'm currently located, they built a clean coal project. I think it was originally scheduled at $4 billion, and now it's $7 billion. And they have a 7-year guaranteed payback clause in their bond financing. So, it's It's not just solar. So it may be that the public perception shifts in the future as solar costs continue to drop, and maybe that solar is viewed as something that lowers electricity rather than raises it. Then we have a question on renewable energy credits, which is, well, how do you monitor renewable energy credits? And one very simple way to do it is through your inverter monitoring. Your inverter has an online monitor that will provide you with a report of all the energy that flows through that inverter. Or you might have a dedicated utility meter that accounts for the same thing. Then the next question might be, well, how do you transfer that renewable energy credit claim to your customer? I came across one community solar program in Virginia where they were actually transferring the renewable energy. Well, they weren't transferring the renewable energy credit to their customer because not that they had any reason to use the renewable energy credits themselves. In Virginia, these credits don't have very much value at all. But they still weren't providing them to the customer because they didn't know how to document the REC transfer to the customer. But actually, here's an electric bill where the customer is on a green choice plan, and you can see that this customer who bought 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, they elected to be on the Nevada Green Energy Rider option, where for 1,036 kilowatt hours, they were charged a premium of 39 or of about 4 cents a kilowatt hour for that electricity. Effectively, this is the renewable energy credit transfer from the power company to the customer. This is where the customer has a document that says, I bought 1,036 kilowatt hours of electricity. And if they can show that they consumed 1,036 kilowatt hours of electricity, they can publicly claim that they are 100% green powered. So again, renewable energy credit transactions at their most basic are simply a way to document the claim of renewable energy. This claim of renewable energy is being sold by the power company to this customer right on their electric bill. And so, that power company really just needed some clarification to their customers on how they are transferring the renewable energy credit. Now, some of you might think, we have a larger audience today, so some of the audience might think, well, is inverter monitoring accurate enough to track renewable energy credits? Or do I need a utility grade revenue meter to track the credits? And the answer is that depends on your exchange. If the utility is buying your RECs through an upfront solar incentive, they're giving you $1 a watt for your renewable energy credit rights. I think in New York State, you might get 30 cents a watt for your rights. There are some upfront renewable energy credit purchase offers still remaining out there. They used to be a lot more popular. Well, the reason why utilities want a utility grade meter is not because of the accuracy between your inverter monitor and your utility grade monitor. The inverter monitor might be 98% accurate, and you can even get a utility grade monitoring option on mini inverters to bring it up to 99.5% accurate. But we're only talking the difference between a 1% accuracy. The reason why utilities want that dedicated meter connected to your solar output is because, when they roll their utility trucks down the street to pick up on your radio frequency of your smart meter, they can collect that data without actually going to the meter and looking at it. So your meter can wirelessly communicate to the utility, and they want to wirelessly pull that information into their database using their system. And that's why they need their meter put onto your solar array if you are selling them your RECs directly through a upfront subsidy or even a longer-term purchasing contract. But if you want to go sell your RECs independently to a third party on a state exchange, if you go and you look at the reporting requirements for the state exchange, you discover shocking and perhaps concerning things, which is, let's just go down the list real quick. We got Washington, D.C., which is to sell your renewable energy credits on DC's REC exchange. If your solar array is under 10 kilowatts, you can log renewable energy credits. You can log your generation based on a PV watts calculation. So in other classes, we show you how to do PV watts. We walk you through the process. It tells you how much energy you're going to produce. But we always talk about how, hey, this is an estimate. It'll vary based off your annual weather. We try and be conservative with our PV watts estimates. You might also be aggressive with your PV watts estimates, and the numbers are going to be completely different if you use a 14% D rate versus a 5% D rate. You're going to get 9% more if you dumb down your PV watts calc. And so what you could have is a solar array logging renewable energy credits into DC system purely based off fictitious, undocumented, made-up numbers, and that's the state regulation. Whereas in Delaware, you need a utility meter that self-reports in the Delaware system, or you need to find a solar inverter with what's called a revenue grade metering option, which will add a few $100 to your inverter for about 1% more accuracy in your monitoring, but you need it to participate in these credit markets. Here are some other states. Maryland, you can do a PV watts estimate. Pennsylvania, you can do a PV watts estimate. New Jersey, which has a very lucrative REC market, you can use a PV watts estimate. I suppose, you're going to be committing fraud if you're logging these renewable energy credits into the system and then selling them if you never actually generate the renewable energy credit. But it's strange because you have utilities mandating meters that are expensive for a 1% uptick in accuracy, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you have your state legislative REC tracking entities that really don't care at all, at least at the residential level, how accurately you're reporting your system production data. I guess they're assuming that if you ever do get audited, that they'll be able to look at your total system production and what you've logged into the system, and you'll get in trouble if they don't balance out. But it does open up the possibility for people logging RECs and selling RECs that don't actually exist. So here we are. Most states across the country have renewable portfolio mandates where a certain percentage of their electricity needs to be supplied through renewable sources by a certain date. So this is cap and trade. It's just run at the state level by your Public Utility Commission, sometimes by your regional grid authority. So every state has these mandates. So the question is, well, if you have a renewable energy project and no one's offering you an incentive for your renewable energy credits, but you're in a state where utilities are mandated to buy these credits, how do you sell them? How do you make your project more profitable by participating in these credit markets? And renewable energy credits in certain markets can exceed the retail value of the electricity itself. Now, these are very limited markets, but they're robust markets because solar is so lucrative in them. So in Massachusetts right now, renewable energy credits are selling for between 25 and 40 cents a kilowatt hour, whereas the retail price of electricity in Massachusetts is around 20 to 25 cents a kilowatt hour. In New Jersey, same thing. Retail price of electricity is around 17 cents. Renewable energy credits are around 24 cents. So you're literally getting over twice the value of retail-based electricity for solar production in those states. And then the District of Columbia as well has some pretty high REC pricing too. Although in other states that have renewable portfolio markets, like Pennsylvania is a good one, Pennsylvania has a renewable portfolio standard. According to this graph, let's see, they want to be 18% renewable by 2021, and yet renewable energy credits are selling for a penny a kilowatt hour instead of 48 cents. So a lot of people get really excited about renewable energy credits because they see the value of RECs in spot markets that have very solar-driven, solar-subsidized legislature. That really doesn't apply to the rest of the country where the market rate for these renewable energy credits are much lower. So it begs the question, well, how much lower do they get? And also, how do you sell them? I'm going to pull up a website just real quick. And the only reason there are other sites that you can go to sell your renewable energy credits, and from my discussions with people who do this, they actually prefer some of the other sites. I like SREC Trade because I don't actually do any business with them, but they put a lot of information on their website, including market pricing. So what we're going to do here is get into their markets and kind of explain a little bit more about SRECs. But here are our markets, and if we just wanted to see what the price of renewable energy credits in Massachusetts is selling for right now, we can go to this SREC Trade site, and here we go. The latest bid price was $272 for an SREC, and what we can see is in March of 2017, we see the SREC prices dropping down to between 270 to 330, or 2016 they were worth $330. In 2017, they're worth about, what was it, 272. And so you can kind of see real-time tracking of REC prices in particular states. But it's really only, another good thing about SREC Trade is, if you're wondering, well, what are the states that have high-priced, solar renewable energy credits? Here's a list of the markets that they participate in, and not all of these markets have very high-priced RECs. It's really right now just New Jersey and Massachusetts and DC. Pretty much if you ever get an offer for buying all of your renewable energy credits, you should probably take it. More on that in a minute. Let's talk about green power purchasing, because green power purchasing also uses renewable energy credits. So a lot of people I talk to say, well, I didn't think anyone would buy my renewable energy credits because my state doesn't really have a robust mandate to buy them, and so there's no value in them in my state. Well, that's not true. There's two applications for renewable energy credits. The first is to meet state mandates, but the second is to supply the voluntary market. Again, about 2% of the United States will voluntarily sign up for a renewable energy plan offered by their utility or third-party provider. And so 2% of a utility's customers will voluntarily increase their electric bill in order to see more renewable energy projects come online. Let's call them environmental do-gooders or environmental altruists, but they exist. Maybe not engineering, hard dollar and cents way, that might not make much sense to you, but from emotional, environmental appeal, from a passionate appeal, that's not everyone, not everyone reads their electric bill even, so you can't just argue that renewable or energy transactions are hard dollar and cents when people aren't really even looking at their bill that hard. So when you sign up for your green power plan through your utility, they are also selling you a renewable energy credit. So there's two markets for RECs. There's the public mandate market, and there's also the voluntary market. So the question is, well, how much do RECs sell for in the voluntary market? And you can find this stuff on the utilities website. Here's Alabama Power, and Alabama Power, you go to their website, you go into their solar frequently asked questions section, and they'll tell you that residential solar costs between $5 and $8 a watt, which is almost twice as much as what solar actually sells for. But Alabama Power doesn't offer net metering despite being a regulated entity, so they're not what I would consider to be a solar-friendly utility, nor do they have to be. But they do sell renewable energy credits, and if you go to their website, you'll see that you can sign up for a renewable energy credit option where they add $1.25 to your electric bill for 12 months, and over the course of the year that equates to $15, and they sell you one renewable energy credit for $15. Now, most utilities will define a renewable energy credit as being equal to 1,000 kilowatt hours of renewable energy production. You could actually sell 1 kilowatt hour of production. We saw that example earlier where they sold 1,036 kilowatt hours of renewable production. So, this REC credit being 1,000 kilowatt hours, it's not like you can't divide it up. But the jargon, when people refer to RECs, if they're referring to a quantity of RECs, one REC typically equals 1,000 kilowatt hours of production. So for $15 per REC, $15 for 1,000 kilowatt hours, that brings you down to $0.015 a kilowatt hour. And remember, your electric bill, in Alabama, it's about 11 cents a kilowatt hour. So to voluntarily increase your electric bill by 16 or 17% for renewable energy is a lot, but they're not selling a 100% renewable option. They're only selling a 1,000 kilowatt hours. The average home in the United States uses 11,000 kilowatt hours a year. So, for you increase your electric bill, by 20%, but only on, about 10% of your bill. And so your electric bill goes up by 2%, and you're offsetting about 8% of your power with renewables through this feature. All right, so basically why this is important is that it establishes a handshake next best offer at the retail market for REC pricing. It suggests that renewable energy credits should have a market value of around $10 to $20 at retail voluntary. The question is, well, how do we get there? Well, before we get to that point, let's shop around a minute. So here we are on Indianapolis Power and Light's website. And if we go in, where you find the value of the RECs is you go into the riders. So here we go into the rates, rules, and regulations. And we go into their regulations, and then we pull up their residential rates or their rules and regulations. But where we're probably going to find it for this one is in contract riders. Because remember, they're delivering you the same electricity either way. So it's very common just to attach a rider that's a renewable energy credit rider to your electric bill to purchase renewable energy. So here we are in Indianapolis Power and Light. You can go to their website. You can pull up their Green Power Initiative rider. That's a voluntary rider to increase your electric bill for renewable energy credit purchases. And the grand finale is, rather than costing $0.015 a kilowatt hour for green power, like it does on Alabama Power's grid, Indianapolis Power and Light will sell you a renewable energy credit for about a tenth of a penny a kilowatt hour. So you're looking at these numbers correctly. What costs, $0.015 a kilowatt hour for Alabama Power costs a tenth of a penny from Indianapolis Power and Light. Right here, for all green powered kilowatt hours purchased, a rate of 0.001 per kilowatt hour will be assessed. Well, that's a huge difference, between $0.015 and a tenth of a penny. The renewable energy credit that Alabama Power is selling costs 15 times more than that from Indianapolis Power and Light for what's equivalent, basically the same product. It's a renewable energy offset, largely supplied by wind. So where's the price difference and price discrepancy coming from? For that, we need to talk a little bit more about how voluntary RECs are exchanged. The leading entity for voluntary renewable energy credits is called Green E, and on their website they publish what they call the Green E National Standard. And the Green E National Standard is the closest thing the industry has to a document that governs voluntary renewable energy credit exchanges. It gets into what years the renewable energy credits can be generated. You can actually sell renewable energy credits that have not been generated yet. So if you think you're going to generate 8 renewable energy credits next year, you can sell them this year. You can sell them in advance. They also have a perishable date. If you don't sell them by a certain date, like 6 months into the previous year, then you can't sell them to Green E. That doesn't mean you can't sell them to someone else, but they wouldn't be qualified for the Green E standard. And when you get into government procurement of renewable energy credits, they don't or the U.S. Green Building Council LEED certification for renewable energy credit purchasing, they often will not require Green E certified RECs, but they do require Green E standards or Green E equivalent standards to meet the procurement. So that's the way they say, we don't really care if you're a Green E product or not, but you still have to abide by the Green E standards. That's their project specification, if you will. And the Green E National Standard and most REC exchanges run by utilities for voluntary markets, they run a system called REC retirement, which is basically they're logging their renewable energy credits into a state database or a state exchange, and then when it comes time to sell the renewable energy credit, they go into the state exchange and they take whatever credits that they're selling out of their inventory. They retire them, and that's so that they can't be double counted towards any utility mandates or sold to other customers. But the problem with REC retirement is one from the customer perspective, because the customer does not get in that exchange, they get a honor pledge from the vendor that the REC has been retired from the database, but they don't get a identification number. They don't get supply chain tracking, so they have no clue where their credit actually came from or who generated it. So there's no way for the customer under the Green E National Standard, which is the #1 standard for voluntary renewable energy transactions in the United States, there's no way for the customer to actually know if the vendor is being honest, because it's all reliant on an honor pledge. And if you're a Bitcoin fan, there are solar Bitcoin projects out there that are trying to use blockchain to put more transparency into this process so that you can't just have people claiming to be renewable powered when they actually haven't bought any RECs, or vendors double dipping their RECs, or just having poor, accounting principles for their RECs too. But if you go and you look at the spirit of the Green E National Standard, you get to this clause. I made it a little bit larger for you on the next slide. That basically says the intent of selling a renewable energy credit is so that you cannot sell it to more than one party. And so prohibited uses of Green E standards would be if there's a conflicting contract for the REC. So if you already sold your REC to the utility, you cannot go sell your REC to someone else. I mean, that's fraud, so you can't do that. But they're clarifying it there. But also it's blurrier than that. Like when the same REC is claimed by more than one party, including any express or implied environmental claims made pursuant to the electricity coming from that resource, including environmental labeling or disclosure. This includes representing the energy as derived in calculating another product's portfolio resource mix. And what that basically means is if I buy a REC from a utility, they cannot go count it towards their state mandated renewable portfolio. The idea is that I'm voluntarily purchasing something, and that voluntary money should go to new renewable capacity. It should not go towards meeting state mandated goals. It should go above and beyond funding of state mandated goals. That's the general principle. You could think about a theoretical consumer and say, do you want to support green energy? And they say yes. And so you sign them up and they give you $15. And if you're the utility and you just use that $15 to meet your own mandated environmental compliance, really what they're doing is making the utility more profit and getting the utility off the hook for their environmental costs, which may be all right, but they're pitching it to the buyer as this is something that helps the environment, and actually all you're doing is making the utility more profitable. It's kind of the opposite of what the volunteer is intending, because they're voluntarily trying to increase renewable capacity and not feed the bottom line of a utility who's primarily involved in selling non-renewable resources. So the utility could be taking their money and basically improving the bottom line of non-renewable resources instead of funding renewables with the vast majority of the money in a REC exchange, if that clause were not met. Or when the REC is used by an electric provider to meet an environmental mandate and also used to satisfy customer sales. And so that's when we get into our community solar programs, we'll see that there's a lot of blurred lines that would not cut mustard if subject to well-established voluntary green energy sales tradition. The community solar programs out there are blurring these lines. And if you want to talk about best practices in community solar, you don't want to get into, blurred lines. You want things to be clear as day. Really what you don't want is the customer trying to get out of their contract 5 or 10 years down the line, halfway into a 20-year contract, because they said, well, I wasn't properly educated when I signed the contract. And I think that's the real danger here, is that you have over-aggressive sales tactics that are blurring voluntary green energy lines that result in the customer not being educated enough to appropriately enter into the contract. This is accounted for in the rest of the solar industry through your solar rebates by like the TVA. When I sign up for the TVA's solar incentive, I have to sign a document that says and they provide it for you on what you can and cannot say about the solar array on your own rooftop. If I'm selling the renewable energy credits for my solar array to a third party like the TVA, I can no longer claim that I'm renewable powered. I can say our installation generates solar energy, which is sold to TVA. We supply TVA with green energy. We increase renewables by selling our energy to the TVA. As a TVA participant, we are supporters of local renewable resources, but I cannot claim that I am solar powered, and I really can't even claim that I'm helping the environment because the TVA is claiming that they're helping the environment. Remember, any environmental claim goes with the renewable energy credit. So the reason why this is a big problem, and what's good is that when you look at the price that customers are willing to pay for renewable energy credits, what we saw is that Indianapolis Power and Light is offering at 0.1 cent a kilowatt hour. We saw that Alabama Power is kind of right in the middle of the pack, offering it at $0.015. And then we saw earlier that Nevada contract writer that was at 4 cents. And so what we see is in terms of customer interest is, you know, yes, they want cheaper renewable energy options rather than more expensive renewable energy options. That's pretty a universal truism. But most renewable energy plans are priced between 1 and 2 cents a kilowatt hour, or between $10 and $20 a rec. And the same is largely true for commercial. Most commercial green energy options are priced between 1 and 2 cents a kilowatt hour, or 1 or 2 cents a rec. But when you get into the cost of the rec, you know, what is the utility purchasing the rec from the windmill to meet these voluntary programs? The answer is less than $1 a rec. And so what Indianapolis Power and Light is doing is basically buying the recs and transferring them to their voluntary customers at cost at 1/10 of a penny a kilowatt hour or $1 a megawatt hour. And what most of the utility industry is doing is buying the credits for $1 and selling them to $15. And so 92% of the revenue, comparing the average sales price of a voluntary rec and the average cost of a voluntary rec, you know, there's 1,000% to 2,000% markup. And who keeps that money? Well, it's the utility. And what does the utility primarily do? Well, they burn fossil fuel. So it begs the question, what does voluntary green energy actually fund? Does it actually go to support renewable power projects, or does it go to support the utility bottom line? And that's the, you know, no customer out there has that level of sophistication. Actually, this is, you know, we're trying to promote our own renewable energy credit product similar to Indianapolis's Power and Light, and so I can vouchsafe that these numbers are absolutely real, because, you know, I'm able to buy renewable energy credits from wind farms for $1 a megawatt hour. You know, I use 11 megawatt hours of electricity a year at my house, so I can offset the entire electric use of my house and claim to be 100% green for $11. But if I signed up for my utilities plan, it would cost me $150. So, you know, renewable energy credits are ripe for abuse. They are being abused. And community solar is a way to kind of fix that. It's an opportunity to get the customer more involved, to understand green energy transactions, to provide an opportunity for customer education because they're very interested in solar power, and to kind of right the wrong right now that is voluntary renewable energy in the United States, an issue that really nobody cares about. But if we can bring a better renewable energy product to market, it might not just be 2% of the United States that participates, it might be many, many more people. I mean, if you ask everyone out there, would you support 100% renewable energy mandate if it only increased your electric bill by 1%? Most people would say yes, because then we wouldn't have to talk about climate change or environmental regulations. We could just move on to the other political discussions that ruin our lives and not worry about renewable energy. So, you know, I don't know. That's the basis for it. So what we're going to do now is we're about an hour and a half into the program, and now we should have a good understanding of the building blocks of renewable energy transactions on regulated and deregulated grids.